Hola, hola, hola. This is Senora Power, bringing back to you all the power, all the senoras, all the time. This is Sonia.
This is Sophia.
And this is Gabby.
And this is the Plática for episode 4. Please listen to part 1, which is about Senora Lupe and and her life story. Part 2 is Senora Mamie Garcia, her life story. And now we're bringing the two together with the goal of discussing how Senora Power is operating with both of these narratives, with both these Senoras' lives, and how we can learn from their strategies when put in conversation together. Are we ready?
Yes.
We're ready. Let's do it.
A ti te dedico mis versos, mi ser, mis victorias. A ti mi respeto, señora, señora, señora.
Okay, so I'm going to be leading us through some of the big topics with our establishment senoras for this plática. And I want to start with this idea of establishment because both Senora Anguiano and Garcia worked with multiple formal institutions, which were kind of defined by specific rules, different kinds of hierarchies within the organization, and specific customs. Senora Anguiano, for example, worked with the Catholic Church and the National Council of Catholic Bishops. She worked with the California Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. She helped co-found the National Women's Political Caucus and was active for many, many years in California LULAC, or the League of Latin American Citizens, which Senora Garcia had a massive impact on. That's how we located her, was through the LULAC archive, where she was district and deputy director of Council 402 in District 8 in Houston. Senora Garcia also founded Sociedad Mutualista Obrera Mexicana, a mutual aid organization, and she worked as the Houston Police Department's community liaison, establishing the Hispanic Officer of the Year Award, which is still a part of current police recognition. It's an award that is still active. So my first question to you is what do you think of the work of these senoras with these diverse establishments?
I think establishment senoras are some of our most interesting senoras just because they have to learn to navigate both community dynamics as well as institutional or, establishment dynamics. So it's a lot of navigation, negotiation, mediation that they have to learn how to engage in, right? So I think in terms of strategies, knowledge, these señoras help us bridge the division between community work and institutionalized work. So I think they're very cool.
I think that's interesting what you bring up, Sophia, about community and institution. I think currently it's hard to think about communities and institutions like as one in a way. And I think that was true back then as well in the, 50s, 60s, and 70s when these women were active. And of course, they're still active today, but that's the time period we're really looking at. You think about that time, and it was very much a time of kind of like institutional imposition of ideologies onto communities. Like there was a lot of like very explicit censorship about what people could say, what political affiliations they could have, and it was very interesting to see these señoras really kind of quote unquote infiltrating. I mean, they wouldn't see it that way, but like going into institutional structures in order to make sure that their communities got what they needed. And so when we talk about survival and resilience, this was clearly their strategy to survive, for their communities to survive. And I think that, I agree with you, Sophia, that makes these señoras really interesting, because I think looking from a present day perspective as somebody concerned for their community's welfare, how do you create the conditions for survival? How do you help your community to survive? Is it like these señoras a participation in institution? Is it something kind of more in between? Or do we need some people to be wholly invested in institution and some people to be wholly divested from institution? So that's, I think, looking at Señora Anguiano and Señora Garcia as two people wholly invested in institution is interesting because Lupe Anguiano actually removed herself from the institution that she was a part of, and in some ways was removed. So I think these are interesting case studies or examples to how far you can survive or how far you can go in an institution that's not necessarily made for you.
These are absolutely excellent points. I love the point about needing different kinds of people to actually protect communities, the people who are completely divested and highly, highly critical of some of these organizations, and the people who are fully invested. But it's still, very community based, which both of these senoras were, which we learned from their stories. I think also it's interesting how different they are. Like the Catholic Church is a very different organization from LULAC, which is a very different organization from the health department. All these different spaces require different kinds of navigation. And so I think it's interesting that both of these senoras had a kind of hope and a kind of toolkit to navigate all of these different things, and just genuinely feel that if there was work to be done, they would do it, and they would do it with whoever was going to give them the resources. And unfortunately, most of the time, those are formal, federal, even legislative bodies.
Yeah, I think whenever we're working within institutions, within establishments, all of these rules and norms and guidelines and procedures come to guide the discussion, as Sonia was mentioning at the beginning of this episode, right? And I think one thing that I'm still trying to think through and grapple with is the structure itself, right? The logic of the establishment, the logic of the institution, because what ends up happening is that all of these senoras engage within these bigger institutions like the Houston Police Department, for example, and then they start to narrow them down. But oftentimes what this means is that we get pockets of little organizations that are housed within a broader institution, such as all of the districts within the LULAC organization and stuff like that, which then leads us to all sorts of divergent perspectives between groups of these same institutions. And our main example, I think, here can be the Chicana Conference in Houston in 1971, right? They're all part of the same kind of institutional affiliation, and yet these pockets are created that, creates a certain kind of conflict, which again, I think conflict is good. I think that friction and tension, these are all things that people need to grapple with in order to come to a more collective kind of agreement. But at the same time, I think that is based around this logic of the institution and the logic of creating the single issue organization kind of thing. Again, I'm not being... I'm thinking critically of it. I'm not being critical of this kind of organization, but just, trying to trace all of the repercussions and all of the effects that the model of the institution creates for us.
Yeah, I think that's a very nuanced and textured way to approach it, which is what it kind of calls for, I think. I want to ask another question that's a little bit comparative, but mostly, do you see Señora Anguiano and Garcia using different approaches to their establishments, different ways that they're navigating them, maybe based in state, California, Texas?
Yeah, I'd like to look at or give context for Lupe Anguiano's side because I spent so much time with her materials. I think that Señora Anguiano entered into religious life feeling that it was something that she could take ownership of. As in, this is a life path that calls to me where I feel that I could fit in. After feeling a little bit displaced, I think in her own community in California for a while, but in the end, it was difficult for her, I think, to realize that actually it was an institution like the other ones she had encountered, that where, you know, and she's very circumspect about this. She's very polite about the whole thing, but she says that she was one of two Latinas in the whole convent where she started out as a novice, and that it was kind of assumed like, oh, you guys are going to be friends together. And they were friends just because they were kind of treated in some ways as outsiders. Although I understand there were other women of color in the convent as novices, but, you know, this was the late 40s, the early 50s in the United States, in the Midwest. So everyone was categorized, I think, in the eyes of the convent other nuns in a different way. So there were Asian American girls who were considered differently than the Latinas, who were considered differently than African American girls who were in the same like convent. I say girls because novices are quite young usually. So experiencing race in a convent, in this space that I think Lupe Anguiano went into feeling that it was above human concerns or beyond human concerns, I'm sure was a shock in a lot of ways. Like, I know that she experienced some homesickness. And this is all just to say that Lupe Anguiano went into this institution of the Catholic Church not seeing it as an institution and seeing it instead as a way out of the constraints of institution that she had lived through. However, going through that process for most of her young adult life, she saw that the way that she had understood, you know, spirituality, of reaching out to people who needed help, of trying to make people's lives better, that was actually censored at the church level. Like, that's the reason why they made it impossible for her to stay, because she wanted to help Chicanos and they told her she was too close to the issue. How much of this was because they perceived her to be Chicana, you know, we don't necessarily know, but yet again, the institution cannot separate itself from, you know, the real societal concerns of how people are racialized, of classism. You know, there's the feeling of we can only help people in need, but we have to keep a distance because we're like the official church. This is, again, in a time, like, she was a missionary in the time in which the Catholic Church was changing perspectives officially. So between what's called Vatican I and Vatican II, so Vatican I being a more conservative way of being, kind of like when all the masses were in Latin and when, you know, certain things were seen as kind of unforgivable, and, you know, they were saying that a lot of different people were going to hell. And after that reform of Vatican II, these things were softened a little bit on the official level. Now, how long that took to reach actual individual churches was a long time. So I'm just pointing to the fact that Señora Anguiano was in the Catholic Church in a time that was highly conservative and very contentious because a lot of people wanted to remain conservative. So being in this institution that she felt was going to be her own, was going to be a ticket out of institutionalization in a way, and finding that it was just maybe the same or very similar, is interesting, because then she left and created, in a way, her own institution, a nonprofit, which was very different. But I think that Señora Anguiano's tactic of dealing with institutions was more born of desperation and necessity once she was in it than perhaps as Señora Garcia, which one of you guys can talk about, that Señora Garcia kind of entered an institution understanding that it was an institution and understanding that her position was confrontational in a way.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to point out about Señora Garcia. Her work with the Houston Police Department first, right, and then all of the different institutions and organizations that she created, it was very much based on a deep, intimate understanding of the role of the police institution in her community, and the sense of responsibility that she had to enter into this institution to actually, you know, bring in this community perspective to actually, you know, create change within this institution, which she actually did, as Sonia mentioned, you know, Many of the programs that she started with HPD are still in place right now, such as, giving the award to the Officer of the Year, which is someone who has a deep engagement with the community itself. So I think it's very interesting, Gabi, what you're pointing out about Señora Anguiano joining the church not as an institution, but as an escape, right? Whereas Señora Garcia is joining the institution to become a part of the institution and to create change from within. I think this is also in part based with the broader kind of activism that happens in Texas, which I feel is, and I'm not trying to generalize here, but based on our señoras, it feels like our Texas señoras are very much more confrontational individually than our California señoras, which is I think it just goes back to the long history of community-based activism in California, whereas in Texas, we have a much more kind of like individual, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of like ideology, and señoras feel that they have to do this work on their own, which then turns into all sorts of different organizations, right? But I do think that there's this sense of like personal, individual responsibility in our Texas señoras.
It's telling when we talk about your analysis of this, Sophia, that Lupe, after leaving the Catholic Church, moved to Texas and created this nonprofit and thrived there. So the connection between the two is clearly there, right? California, Texas. And it's also very clear that the culture of activism for women, for Chicanas specifically, has different cultures, in each space. I think it's more about like how that community reacts to señoras and then how that shapes their future endeavors, right? Because, Alicia Escalante was very confrontational, quote unquote, but she was also arrested and served time for a long time in an effort to quell that kind of response in California. So yes, I think it's interesting to see like, Lupe be like, I'm disillusioned with California, I'm going to Texas. And in fact, actually, like you see, yeah, I know, it's so funny. And you see a lot of people now do the opposite, go from Texas to California, me, but also that in the past, I think señoras considered it as well, the idea of like, oh, California is the center of Chicana activism right now. Like, what can I learn there?
This is all fantastic, and we can at any point return back to this question of establishment, or if you think of one that we haven't talked about yet, please feel free to return back to that. But this conversation is reminding me a lot of another sensitive topic to consider, because both señoras in their work with establishments had to confront police brutality in Mexican American communities. And I know that when we were learning about Señora Garcia, I don't remember if she said it herself in her interview, but she mentioned how there were a lot of conservative Mexican Americans in the Houston community, but it was police brutality that really brought them all together despite political differences. And for Señora Garcia, she directly helped her community in the aftermath of Houston police murdering Jose Campos Torres and the subsequent Moody Park riot of 1978. I don't think any of this team will forget when we interviewed her and she remembered this moment. It was incredibly emotional. And for Señora Anguiano, when LAPD violently interrupted her teen post boxing match, abusing their power to create conflict in the Mexican American community and use their position of authority to crack down on the youth. So I guess my question to kind of open up this conversation is what are some of their strategies that they use to endure this violence and to help their community heal in something that feels so cyclical and difficult?
I think, first of all, I think it's important to note, because this helped me personally make sense of things, that the way that the police were organized in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in these locations is different than now. Now being 2024, for example. Um, so the way that these señoras approached it was able to be very different than the way that someone would approach it today, for example. Um, I can say for Señora Anguiano, and I think for Señora Garcia too, it was a very personal thing. Like for them, it was kind of like when you break it down into people, then you can get somewhere. And so for Señora Anguiano, it was about like activating her contacts, about saying like what went wrong. Because in the case of Lupe Anguiano with her program of Teen Post in Los Angeles in the 60s, the whole point of the program was to try to create an alternative for young people, specifically young men usually, to not go into gang life or not be defined by gang life. And for the police to break into a boxing match, which the program had created in order to relieve aggression or tension, that's like a huge violation of the agreement they had with the police already to say, we're going to do this, please don't come in here. So clearly we see in this moment the failure of the approach of personalized contact with the police. This one instance was a failure of that approach that they were relying on for safety. And in fact, a lot of the organizers got injured during that raid, including Señora Anguiano herself. After the fact, there was like a lot of apologies and like they were like, oh, we didn't mean to, or we didn't know. So that approach, I guess, was their only recourse. They continued to kind of say, okay, like, can we please like pay more attention to the schedule we're giving you? Like, please don't interrupt our stuff. But it's also very telling that Señora Anguiano, like, while she was trying to thread this needle of Catholic Church institution and concern for her community, she found it necessary to go to protest. Like, one of these protests was really the reason why the church was like, we need you to leave. And she, I think, went to protest specifically because she began to see kind of the violence that happened through these established institutions, kind of no matter what you did. And that was Señora Anguiano's experience in Los Angeles at that time. So I will say that for her, there was no, I don't see a solution necessarily there. I see more of like a recourse to gathering up your community closely, to recommitting to the young people that they were actually responsible for, and to saying like, we are going to go out on the streets and make our displeasure known because this is our right as, you know, citizens of this city. So in that regard, I think it kind of echoes a lot of what one would do currently as well. But I know Señora Garcia had a different strategy.
Well, I think it's funny, I guess, interesting that we're talking about establishment señoras, but we're now shifting over to their community-based strategies, right? Such as what Gabby was saying with Señora Anguiano and all of the community organizing that she did. One of the things that Señora Garcia really emphasized in our interview with her was the fiesta supermarket kind of mutual aid food drive that she and her community would organize, right? So as Gabby was suggesting, they're, yes, working within these institutions and learning to navigate these establishments, but they're also very much mobilizing the community itself in what I would call something akin to relajo, or like fiesta, or like having a good time. Even when we think about the Teen Post boxing match, right? That's a way to let out frustrations in this more non-serious, relajiento way. And yeah, just the political benefits, the political effects of just getting your community together and having an enjoyable time outside of the overarching sense of precarity and violence that these communities were feeling at the time, outside of all of these, outside of like the broad difficulty to get something like a white collar job, to achieve something like social mobility, to achieve something like financial stability, because 40s, 50s, 60s, they are still a time where hierarchical racial structures in terms of labor are still very much in place. Even if we have our Señora Carmen Cortez as one of the first Chicanas in Houston to get a white collar job in like the 40s, this is still like not the norm, and it doesn't become the norm until after the 60s, after the Chicano movement and things like that, right? So yeah, I don't know, I am just holding on to the fact that these señoras like to have a good time, and one of their strategies is to organize moments for the community where all of the outside violence, the outside hierarchization of bodies and people, all of these things don't matter, and the community can just, hang out, have a good time.
I think I think yes, and what's also interesting about both of these Senora strategies to endure police brutality and police control over Mexican American communities and infiltration is to establish some kind of familiarity with the police officers themselves. So, like Gabby, when you were retelling the Senora Anguiano's response to the raid, one of her responses, well, familiarize yourself with our schedule, like figure it out, get to know us, get to know what we're doing so that you don't make this mistake again. And Senora Garcia obviously establishes this Hispanic Officer Award because she wants to see police officers come from the communities that she's involved with. I remember her telling us that she wanted, she thinks a sort of radical approach to police reform is to establish, what did she call them? They were like mini police stations in each community. Storefronts, thank you. And she wanted these storefronts to have established police officers who rotated but had a very, they were familiar faces. They were people who either came from the community and became police officers or were very, very familiar with the community. And I think this is one of their strategies of, if the institution can recognize our humanity, then they will not be as brutal towards us. I think that, I don't know if this strategy holds as much weight today in our post George Floyd movement and our post, I don't know, reckoning, I guess, with the way that the way the police structure does not have room for racialized humanity, cannot accomplish that as an organization. And I don't know, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, I guess. It's something I'm still wrestling with, but I recognize it as a shared strategy between the two of them.
Yeah, I think this is why we are kind of talking around this as a very time-specific strategy, because the storefront policing, for example, that Senora Garcia was referencing was something that was in place while she was active. So meaning that there were like 5 police officers stationed in a community that like would not leave for a long time. People knew who they were, and it was just them. So that is a far cry. Obviously, that still had its issues. Like, obviously, people were still murdered at that time. But I think that we have a very different system now where neighborhoods are militarized. Like, it's not like 5 police with batons. It's like an entire squadron with firearms, right? Who are trained to use those firearms at the slightest provocation. As we've seen time and time again, this is not a conjecture. This is how police are trained. And you can trace that difference to, late 70s, 80s, to, criminalizing racialized communities and how that became kind of a cyclical way of making sense of violence towards racialized communities. It's like, oh, we are violent towards racialized communities because they're criminals. Racialized communities are criminals, period, right? Like, that's kind of like, it's empty of real substance, it's empty of real meaning. It's just kind of the way that stereotyping and racism has been aimed at excusing militarized force in communities. So that's a long way to say that when you are faced with an entire militarized institution, and the whole point and training of it is for the individuals in that system to not have individuality, to not have a face, to not step outside of their training, then the strategies that worked for maybe Señora Garcia, it's harder to implement them. But what I will say on the other side, the flip side of it, maybe learning from Señora Anguiano and also Señora Garcia, what her lasting message is organizing your community is always going to be an option. And, you know, when, as Señora Garcia says, when you knock on your neighbor's door, that's a very powerful thing. And Señora Anguiano's response to her program not being respected, to children not being respected by the police, was to go back to the community, was to realize, okay, we have this responsibility to young people in the community so that they have a better future. So when you realize that your goal is not to make an institution understand you, if they already are not going to do that, the goal is to make sure the community has enough power to survive.
I think that's such a great point about, you know, we know what the structure of the institution is. We know what the logic behind the institution is, which, you know, persists today. I mean, in the state where I'm at right now, I know that in order to become a police officer, you only need a high school diploma and like a 2-week training that does not include anything about cultural sensitivity, racial awareness, anything like that. So we have both ends of the spectrum right now, right? Where certain cities are hyper militarized cop cities, right? And then certain other places are just very much like whoever wants this kind of job can enter and, you know, become a part of the police force. So we know the issues with the institution. We know what the institution is for. So despite all of our señoras' work and attempts to changing these institutions, they persist, right, with their very specific logic. So I think the point that Gabby ended with, the fact that it's very important, the fact that we need to understand that the institution is the way it is, but that the community itself has a certain kind of responsibility to understanding how the institution works, as a way to navigate it, as a way to avoid it, as a way to defend individual rights, you know, like for people to just be aware of their rights in relation to the institution, which, you know, at a certain point, it's not going to save us, but it helps us understand what our role to each other and what our responsibility to our community members is, and that is to never call the police on anyone.
Yeah, I think y'all are both incredibly smart. Those are very nuanced takes. And I think our señoras are very smart as well. I want to maybe conclude this part of the conversation with Señora Garcia telling us that police officers should be social workers, not militarized gun-wielding squadrons, right? But people invested in social services. And I remember her telling us a story about the way she would help people post bail because not everybody spoke English. Not everybody was able to understand the jailing system. So being on the inside, she literally walked people through how to post bail and get out. So I think this is a fantastic example of exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so the last place I want to bring us is to really señora power as like a concept, you know. We've kind of talked through power, we've talked through the establishment, But what is it about these señoras that garnered them respect from their community? And do you think that their strategies are gendered in specific ways?
Senora Anguiano's strategies necessarily were gendered from the very beginning because she entered a convent, which is a very gendered place. But I guess bad jokes aside, she is very conscious of herself as existing and being perceived as a woman because in her youth there was this pressure of like date boys, which she did, and in high school, and maneuver that world. And also I think it's actually quite beautiful that a lot of these boys that she dated were also her friends, and she was very concerned for them like on an individual level in a time when they had to participate in warfare, and some of them passed away because of this, were killed in active duty. So I think she saw gender in that way as well. The idea of boys going out, having to be active, the flip side of that, like, being killed, and women staying back, and also the concept of widowhood that happened in her community. There's also, entering the convent, this idea of femininity that is kind of beyond the touch of society. And what that actually allowed her to do. So being in that position was kind of a privileged position within community, saying like, I'm beyond like the touch of normal society, I guess, or beyond like the roles that women in these societies are usually allowed to be in. At the same time, she was constrained within the church. Nuns, the way that, it seems that it worked in her specific case, there was a authority within like the convent structure who was a nun, but the highest authority was a man, because there's always a bishop or a cardinal, and as we know in the Catholic Church, women cannot hold those positions. So the way in which she acted was kind of allowed for a bit, because it was like, oh, you're a woman, so obviously you're like empathetic and kind, and you have a kind heart, and that's okay. But when she became more active in like what some might call militant politics, so like saying, I'm going to go out on the streets and protest, I'm going to push back against these men's ideas. I mean, the bishop and like the cardinal of her area wrote her letters being like, what are you doing? This was not normal for nuns, right? So there is a real way that you can see that her gender allowed her to enter a space where she was able to gain some sort of authority, where she was able to, be a part of this teen post program as a nun, where other women weren't necessarily allowed to do that. But at the same time, she was still constrained by the concepts of religious femininity. Like, you cannot go out into the streets and protest. You cannot go farther than what our role for you is, right? And our being like a male dominated institution. Outside of that, when she left the Catholic Church, becoming a nonprofit, I guess, CEO, leader, founder, it was completely gendered, because her organization was for young women or women who were single mothers, to retrain them and help them get jobs that normally women wouldn't be able to do. Like, she helped the first, I think, female welder in Texas get her job and get the training for that job. She helped women who had been constrained to welfare. This was kind of her understanding of it, right? Been constrained to welfare, because they weren't seen by society to be competent people on their own, to have jobs to support their families, right? They weren't actually the breadwinners, but they were the only adults in their household. So, I think Señora Anguiano creating this organization shows her knowledge of gendered strategies, shows her knowledge of like having to exist in the world in a gendered body, because it was clear that creating an organization specifically for women to enter the workforce makes it that shows that she understood that women had different circumstances in society that she had gone through in a certain way, and the way that she was trying to help other women surpass that or go around it, or in some ways like become more than that. I think it's very clear that necessarily she was she was gendered by the institution she was in, but also that she understood that existing in the world as a woman created constraints that she wanted to break or help people go around.
That's a great point, Gabby. And your comments make me think about the both the intersections and the differences between gendered spaces like the convent versus gender strategies, right? Such as all of the different activities that our señoras are doing in order to insert themselves as gendered bodies into these very specifically gendered spaces. And here we're speaking about male-centric spaces, the church, the police department, even Latino activist organizations, right? But I think that with Señora Garcia, we see how she uses these specific gender strategies that she also learned, obviously, from gendered spaces, right? Such as school in the 40s and 50s and 60s, right? But I think that her particular strategies of being a part of the community, of knocking on people's doors, like I keep imagining what I would do if Señora Mamie came knocking on my door versus if like a man came knocking on my door. I think that I would have very different reactions to that moment. And I think that she knew that, right? In all of her work going around the community, she knew that people would respond in a certain way to a woman showing up and asking them to become an active participant in these acts of protest and reform and community building, right? So I think that all of our señoras are showing us that putting the gendered body on the line is a very risky thing to do, and yet it has all of these coalitional effects, right? Because I don't know, gender is a thing that we're all attuned to, and I think I would not be the only person who reacts badly if a man shows up knocking on my door. But maybe that is just me.
I'm thinking of Senora Garcia collecting business cards from people, and Anguiano's networking and connections. I think that networking is considered either a neutral strategy or a male-dominated strategy. I'm thinking like businessmen and, Wall Street and all these spaces. But I kind of want to claim that the way that they do that work is gendered, that the way that they connect people is a gendered strategy, especially when they're looking to connect women who need work, women who need to get out of domestic situations, women who need childcare, who are offering childcare. I don't think that Senora Garcia would turn down a business card from anybody, no matter their gender. But I think that the way that they're doing the connecting work between community members is almost holistic, is sort of knowing who they are, what institution they might represent, but also what are their interests, what are their side hobbies, what can they offer in any sort of capacity that she can connect different people with. And I guess I think of that as a part of their womanhood, a part of the way that they navigated their gender.
I'm just thinking about how the specific issues that our señoras are dealing with are also gendered. As you were saying, Sonia, like it's not just about collecting the business cards, it's about knowing who can offer what to certain issues that are also specifically gendered, and forming these like coalitions across all community members and not just the people who are impacted by a specific issue. So I think it's a lot of the work of educating people, not just about how the police system works, not just about how what the church can offer you or things like that, but also um, about highlighting how everyone has a role and responsibility within all of these specific issues, even when they're considered women issues or like men issues or whatever. I think that is the gendered strategy to actually consider how gender has an impact on the community as a whole and not just specifically gendered people.
Well, thank you both for having this plática. I think it was really fun. These are interesting señoras. They're interesting. All right. That's all we got. This is our plática. And please stay tuned for more Señora Power.